Hey everybody, this is the Scholar Journal Mojian and Bing. So first I have to apologize because it's been a very long time since I published my last video. I'm sorry about that. I've been fairly busy lately. But the good news is that I've been working on a project and I finally got done with something. And that is a translation of a Qing dynasty Saber manual or 刀谱. Now, this 刀谱 is very unique because it's much older than some of the other 刀谱 that we have access to. For example, a lot of the ones that people have translated online previously are from the 20th century, the early 20th century. But this one dates back, at least parts of it, good chunks of it date back to the early 18th century. So that's about 200 years or so earlier than many of the other Saber manuals that we can find. And in addition to that, unlike some of the Ming Dynasty manuals, this is a manual which, for one, focuses on the single-handed saber used alone. So it's not used with a shield, and it's not the two-handed saber. And in addition to that, this manual also talks about dueling. So it's not exclusively about saber versus spear. There's a little bit of that, but the majority of the manual is talking about paired weapon, or talking about, one-handed saber versus one-handed saber. So that makes it unique and quite a bit different than many of the other manuals. Now in today's video, first I want to kind of give a basic overview about where this manual comes from and, what its context is historically. And then I want to go into what we can and can't learn from this and what are the limitations that we might face using this manual. This manual is known as the 万代流传刀谱, or the Saber manual meant to be passed down for 10,000 generations. It's a very clunky translated name. Don't worry too much about the translated name. The original preface states that it was first written in 1725 and under the Kangxi Emperor. The story goes that the Kangxi Emperor gathered a bunch of high-level martial artists together and had them practice for a few years to develop a good, solid saber fighting system. And then that was taken and recorded down to train the Imperial Eunuch bodyguard force. These are not just regular soldiers. These are high-level martial artists that have, from various backgrounds, and it's a collaborative effort in developing this saber system. That's what the preface states, at least. But, you have to be careful with these things because the preface of the text, for many of these, older texts is, kind of like how they're proving their own legitimacy, and they're gonna sometimes say things that make them sound better than their rivals might agree to. The context of the manual also leads me to believe that it is indeed, an old document that is associated with the imperial court, because the original is housed in the Forbidden City collection, 故宫. And the way I accessed this manual was by basically in about the early 2000s, 2001, the Forbidden City made a massive series of publications where they kind of got all of the material in their archives and they compiled it into these massive volumes, and they released that to certain libraries that were, able to afford it. And when I say able to afford it, that's because the whole series had over 730 volumes or something. So it's like, imagine an encyclopedia that's 730 books long of just old Chinese texts that are in the Forbidden City. This manual is found in volume 360 of this massive collection. So given the fact that this manual does indeed come from the Forbidden City archives, that is a pretty strong argument in favor of its legitimacy as being associated with the Imperial Palace. However, I do also want to talk about the date. So the preface of the text is dated to around 1725 or so, and then it follows with some more content. However, at the very end of the text, in the last couple pages, another date is given kind of out of the blue, and that date is 1845. It could be that someone added some later pages onto an earlier manual. It could also be that someone copied down an earlier manual and then added to it when they copied it down. And this brings up a question of how old is some of the content. And personally, I believe that much of the content is quite old because as soon as you get to the preface where they say the 1725 date, they have a table of contents, and that table of contents contains much of the manual, not all of it. There's a little bit that comes afterwards that's not included. And I suspect that what has happened is there was an older text and it had a table of contents, and what happened was later on someone, transcribed this text, they copied it back down, and then they wrote another date as they added a few more things to it. But that was no longer included in the original table of contents. Now, I don't have a solid way of verifying that, and the dating of this text is a very interesting question. However, even if the text dates to a later date, it's still, early 19th century, late 18th century, somewhere in that time frame, which is a much better picture of Qing dynasty Daofa than many of the other records that we have. In addition to that, I also want to bring up, there's another text which I have not been able to locate yet, but it is another Qing dynasty Saber manual, which appears to have almost identical or very similar content to the one that I've translated here. And that is one that includes pictures. So the one that I have access to that I've translated, it's all text. It's all written, right? So there's no images. However, there is another different type of Qing dynasty imperial bodyguard eunuch saber fighting manual that does have some images, and some of the lines that we can see from it, we only have about 4 pages of it. Some of the lines of it are identical to the manual that I've translated here. So that also implies that this manual is connected in some way to that other one, at least as far as the content goes. Now let's talk about the content of the manual itself and, what's actually in this thing. So the first big thing that stood out to me that made me want to translate this manual is because it has a series of partner forms. So it's not just that it has a form where it, gives a taolu, a basic routine that you do, but it also includes partner forms. And partner forms can be very useful, especially whenever we're looking at some older things, because it tells you what to do when the opponent makes a certain move. And if you just have the single set, you can work with that, but it's not as clear of a picture, and it's much easier to try and reconstruct something if you have an idea of, what the opponent's doing. There are 12 total partner forms within the text. Each one of them has about 8 moves or so. So what I mean by that is it says that, I go out and I chop the guy's neck, and then the guy does this, then I do this, and it goes back and forth 8 times. And it has 12 of those. So that's quite a bit to work with. There are some issues with interpretation. I'm not going to get into all the details right now, but that's a fairly good chunk of the manual. And that's some really useful stuff if we want to try and, reconstruct Qing dynasty Daofa. In addition to that, the text also contains a lot of verses. Now, in Chinese martial arts, aside from Taolu, many people know about Taolu as a pedagogical methodology. So it's the way that masters taught their students is through routines. That's very true. But another common method that masters would use to give knowledge to their disciples is by verses, basically short memorized rhymes that impart some type of useful knowledge about either a technique or a general principle or something like that. And there are quite a few verses in this text, and they cover a variety of topics. Some of them are about certain techniques, or how you, for example, there's a few verses about what you do when you go against a staff. What do you do when you go against a spear? Some general principle stuff. There's also a couple verses which talk about kind of your mindset a little bit about the fight. You have to approach some of these things differently than the Taolu, because it operates slightly differently. But overall, once again, it's good for helping us build a better, clearer picture of this time period and the saber fighting that they were doing. Aside from the 12 partner forms and the verses, there's also a section of the text which is it's just a regular form, basically, like what we are very familiar with. This form is known as Ruyi Jindao. Now, Ruyi is a little object. It's like a scepter, and these have a extremely long history in China, and they have a variety of meanings. But just know that it was emblematic of a very learned person. So you have the scepter, and Jindao is golden saber. So Ruyi Jindao, scepter, golden saber, that's how I've translated it. This Taolu supposedly exists in, a couple lineages of Baguazhang that are still being practiced today. I have not been able to find out hardly any information about that, but it's something I'm looking into still. It goes pretty in depth throughout this entire form. However, it's written in a very coded language. So one of the reasons that I really like the partner forms is because it's like, I chop him, he does a rising cut to my wrist, like that kind of thing. However, in the form with just one person, it speaks with very metaphorical language, where there's always like the monkey is picking fruit and the dragon is, emerging from the water, this kind of stuff, where it's much harder to interpret. I should say that some of these movements, like, white snake spits out its tongue, can be found in this manual and also in living traditions today. However, it's difficult to know if the way they do it in living tradition now is similar to the way they were doing it when this manual was written. So working through the manual some more, once you get through that taolu, or that performance routine, it then goes into a couple more verses, and then at the end it gives a little bit of a diagram of how you move through the form. And at this point, the manual is no longer following the original table of contents. So my suspicion is that the original older content would go all the way up through the routine done by a single person, and then after a few verses later, it will perhaps move on to the newer, later author. What it mostly appears to focus on, though, is the single person form of the scepter, golden saber. And what I mean by that is it kind of gives you a little chart that shows you how you can move through it, and then it talks a little bit more about some of those postures that you find within it. What I want to talk about now is what are the limitations of this manual, what can we learn and what can't we learn, and what are the difficulties that we would face working with it. So I have made this manual completely open and free, and that's because I want people to read it. I want as many people to be trying it out as possible, having fun, thinking about it. However, I haven't gone in much detail about what I think some of these moves look like and what I think how these forms are working and that kind of thing. And that's because I'm still forming an opinion about a lot of it. And on top of that, I want to see what other people would think of outside of my own mind. I don't want to just show my own interpretation and then have people just go with it because it's what they've seen, and then they start to think with that mindset whenever they look at the form. So I want to see what people come up with on their own, separate from my own brain, and kind of my ideal would be to have a broader community effort into working with these forms and trying to come up with plausible interpretations, much like the human community has around certain texts. So in the human community, there are, differing schools of thought about certain texts and certain techniques and all this other stuff. However, over time, some of the texts have come closer to what I would say maybe a general consensus, where after they have put a bunch of ideas out on the table, they pressure tested all of them, and they've thought about them more. Eventually they can say, well, maybe this one wasn't quite right, maybe this one is more likely to be true, that kind of thing. There will have to be somewhat similar process with this text. However, I also want to express the fact that these are just words, and words do not capture a lot of the nuances of actual movement. For example, what I mean by that is the manual will reference certain types of cuts or certain types of steps and certain body movements, and you might have a good idea of, what that might look like in one part of one form, but if you go to another form, or if you look at another section of the same form, all of a sudden, if you do the same movement the same way you did it at a different point, it stops making sense, even though they use the same words. And that makes things complicated, obviously. So there's still a lot of work to do. I think, if we could find the original picture manual, the manual with painted images, that would be immensely helpful for some of this stuff, of course. I have also provided the scans of the actual original text into my translation kind of at the end, so people who are able to can look through that. However, I should say that this text is far from perfect. So there's several parts where the author uses makes some interesting choices in how they format some things. For like, they'll be writing, the standard way to write in Chinese is to go top to bottom, right to left. And however, there's some parts where they're using the intralinear text, so they'll have smaller text next to the main column of text or underneath the main column of text. And whenever they're doing that, they might be switching the order around in very weird ways, not consistent. And there's also times where it seems like they're not using their words super consistently, because they'll have like a very similar phrase with like slightly different word. And sometimes you could chalk that up to being a different meaning. However, other times it seems like the author is a little bit sloppy in how they approach some things. And you also notice this with some of the spelling. So some of the characters are spelled in very non-standard ways or inconsistent ways. And in my own text, because I was having to, I transcribed this entire text. Whenever I transcribe it, I have to make decisions about what I think that character actually is, or what kind of spelling I think they actually intend. So I highlight those characters kind of in red throughout my transcription. However, if we take a step back and we think about what that means from a broader perspective about the interpretation of the techniques, it means that there's still quite a bit of wiggle room. Basically, there's slight variations in some of the characters, there's some of the spelling, some of the word order in some parts, and that makes it where it's not a super clear, consistently written description of the form itself. And this kind of brings me to this other point I want to make, which is that not all manuals and texts will necessarily be created equally in terms of how easily they are understood and reconstructed. I don't know of any kind of like particular word for this concept, but the reconstructability of a manual could be very difficult or very hard depending on exactly how it's written, how consistent the logic is within it, and some other factors such as that. I personally believe that we can learn a lot from this text, otherwise I wouldn't have tried to put too much effort into translating it. I think that there's a lot of good potential, insight into Qing Dynasty saber fighting in there. However, I just want to caution against any kind of definitive ideas or statements, because the fact is that this is very much a complicated text, and it's an ongoing process, and you don't ever want to land on an interpretation, and you don't want to say it's 100% true or something like that. You always want to say it's high likelihood of being true. But that's possibly just me being pedantic. All right, so that wraps it up for this video. I just want to encourage everybody to, go download the manual for free. I made it a free PDF, so go look at it. If you want to, come up with some interpretations of the forms with a partner, see what you can do. Just be safe, have fun, and make some videos and send them to me, and I'll be happy to look at them. Now, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, and don't forget to stay sharp.